There you go. Take it away.
Thank you, Lynn Ann and the CPD team here in SUNY for helping us bring these webinars to you. This is the second of our SUNY Historians Network pilot webinar series, funded very generously by an innovative instructional technology grant from the SUNY system, and organized by the SUNY History Lab, which is a new initiative at SUNY Brockport, where I'm based. I'm Michael Kramer, a historian at SUNY Brockport, and the director of the SUNY History Lab. And the project is intended to try to foster connections across our very decentralized system for explorations in historical inquiry, ranging from research exchange to teaching roundtables to contemporary issues that historians might want to convene meetings about, a way to use technology to connect across campuses better around the work that we do as historians and those interested in historical research. If you're interested in organizing a webinar for next year or in contributing to the SUNY History Lab project, in the chat, you should see some links to the rest of our series, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as to the SUNY History Lab homepage. And there's a mailing list you can join if you want to just follow along. You can also feel free to find my email there and reach out to me with any proposals for presentations or events that you might want to organize in the next academic year after this one. I'm sure everyone has not very much free time between now and the end of this academic year. So, but I hope you do have enough time to join us for the rest of tonight. We have Dr. Kevin Sheets and Dr. Randi Storch, the leaders of a fascinating project that involves many SUNY historians. I will introduce them and what they'll be talking about tonight, along with two of the participants in the project, Rennie Scott-Childress and Scott Moranda, one of a number of participants in this really interesting project that's underway, led by Kevin and Randi. Before I do so, I just want to remind you of the two upcoming SUNY Historians Network webinars. On May 1st, next week, we have a webinar about multiple methods for Haudenosaunee history. Sorry about that. It's getting late in the day after teaching a lot. And so we'll have three historians, Dr. Montgomery Hill from SUNY Buffalo, Dr. Maeve Kane from SUNY Albany, and Dr. Michael Oberg from SUNY Geneseo, sharing their research into local Indigenous and Native American history from different methodological perspectives. So a chance to get to learn more about the research they're doing and the similarities and differences across these approaches to the past of Indigenous history. And then our final webinar of the academic season will be on June 6th from 4 to 6 p.m. Sorry, the May 1st webinar is from 5 to 7 p.m. On June 6th from 4 to 6 p.m., Dr. Corey A. Graves from SUNY Albany will be presenting her research project underway about African Americans and abortion between 1950 and 1972. So please join us for these events. You can register online at the link in the chat. Before I introduce Dr. Sheets and Dr. Storch, I just wanted to say that the way we have run these events is that we welcome you to place questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom webinar system. And once the presentations are complete, we'll open up for discussion. I will invite you to either unmute and read your question out loud, or if you wish, I can read the question for you. You can note in your comment, in your question, what you would prefer, or I'll just ask as we get to that part of the evening. Okay, so tonight we're exploring Voting Rights and Voices from Beyond. Sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Tonight we're exploring Beyond the City, replacing the Gilded Age and Progressive Era in New York State and beyond. This is a project put together by Kevin and Randi, now under contract as a book with SUNY Press that explores a new approach to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, in which they introduce instructors to place-based pedagogy that aligns with the new scholarship of the era and decenters the traditional urban-only narrative of this time period in U.S. history. Dr. Sheets is a professor of history and chair of the department at SUNY Cortland, the author of Sources for America's History, a 2-volume collection of primary sources for AP and college survey courses published by Bedford St. Martin's Press, as well as the author of articles on cultural and educational history. He's organized and chaired many sessions with K-12 teachers focused on historical pedagogy at professional conferences. He's been awarded 3 Department of Education Teaching American History grants. It'd be nice if those came back. Administering close to $3 million in grant funding for teacher professional development. And he, along with Dr. Storch, have co-directed 5 previous NEH Landmarks of American History and Culture workshops and summer institutes. They've authored an article together, A Case for the Adirondacks, Forever Wild in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for History Matters, and Roughing It, parentheses, with Servants, of course, one of my favorite titles, for the Humanities magazine back in 2020. And the previous article is from 2016. Dr. Randi Storch is a professor of history at SUNY Cortland as well, a leading labor historian, recipient of the SUNY system's highest honor, the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. She is author of Working Hard for the American Dream, American Workers and Their Unions, 1920 to the Present, and the book Red Chicago, American Communism and Its Grassroots, 1928 to 1935. She has also been involved in NEH Landmarks of American History and Culture workshops and summer institutes, as previously mentioned, and has collaborated with Dr. Sheets on the aforementioned TAH grants and has published on labor history and on pedagogy, particularly helping teachers incorporate labor and working class history into their classrooms. I'm going to let Kevin and Randi introduce Rennie and Scott as we kind of move and flow into their presentations. Welcome to all for being here. Once again, it's nice to have you. Hope to see you at the rest of our events coming up. And I hand it over now to Kevin and Randi. Thank you for sharing your work with us today.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
I'm going to share the screen so you can see our snazzy PowerPoint. So thanks everyone for being here, and thanks especially to Michael, really for your vision for creating SUNY Lab, as this amazing forum and resource for us to collaborate and share. This really resonates with Randi and me because we very much prize opportunities for the kind of cross school, cross SUNY collaborations. Some of you might remember when Randi was chair of the history department at SUNY Cortland a number of years ago. She organized a SUNY historian conference that took place on our campus, and maybe some of you were able to attend that. And that was a really rich experience, I think, that brought historians together, SUNY historians together to talk about our work, but also things like this. What should we try to accomplish in the survey classes, and what do good history assessments look like? And it really was a lovely opportunity for many of us, really for the first time, I think, to get to know our SUNY colleagues. And so we really prized that opportunity. And in many ways, the humanities initiative grant that Randi and I got is an extension of that. I'm realizing I have the wrong slide up when I'm talking. So thanks, Michael, for sort of enabling all of this. I want to talk about the Humanities Initiative grant that Randi and I received. that provided funding for our collaboration with our SUNY colleagues. So the Humanities Initiative is an NEH program. Michael mentioned that Randy and I had a number of NEHs in other grant programs from the NEH, Landmarks in American History and Culture grants, and also Summer Institutes. Those all deal with K-12 teachers. What was interesting about the Humanities Initiative is that it allowed us an opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues across SUNY. So Randy and I applied for a Humanities Initiative grant. And in particular, we applied for a faculty study group that the Humanities Initiative grant would fund. And we were lucky enough to receive that. And so thanks to the NEH, of course, for being such a wonderful partner with us over the years. And the idea behind the Humanities Initiative grant was to get our colleagues, historians across SUNY, who taught or researched in the field of the late 19th and early 20th century, so the GAPE, right, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, get them together and engage in conversations about what they were doing in that field or how they were teaching the courses in that field. We have, SUNY Cortland has an amazing asset, a resource, and you see a picture, sort of a picture right there that gives you a hint of it. This is SUNY Cortland's Camp Huntington, which is a National Historic Landmark site located on Racket Lake in the Adirondacks. And that is itself an artifact of the Gilded Age. It's a camp built in the 1870s and has a storied history. And we have been using it as a history department for years with our students and also with our K-12 teachers in our other NEH grants. And we thought this was a perfect setting for us to host our SUNY colleagues and provide us, all a space and time to engage in conversations really about sort of reimagining the GAPE, right? And so we recruited colleagues from across the SUNY campuses, about 14, 16 or so colleagues ultimately were able to join us. We also invited 2 scholars outside of SUNY to spend the week with us. So Kristen Hoganson from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and Rebecca Edwards, who's a professor of history at Vassar. Both of them were able to join us and spend the week. So we spent that week right there where you're looking on that picture. That's Racket Lake. So we were able to spend the week engaged in conversations about the history of the period, but also the historiography of the period, the sources that we typically use, or sources that are sort of interesting and creative and we hadn't thought about before. And so, our colleagues brought in sources that are sort of their favorite fun sources to use during class. And then general conversations about teaching, how best should we teach this period? And our goal really was to reimagine the GAPE. And as Michael alluded to, much of the approach to this period emphasizes the city. And so our goal was to interrogate that urban focused approach to the GAPE, to interrogate periodization. When are we talking about? When does it start? When does it stop? Is it a period that holds together? Interrogate the name. Does Gilded Age and Progressive Era work as a name? Is that meaningful in any particular way? Are there other ways that we should conceptualize this period? Interrogate the typical focus of the period. What are the topics that get used and addressed in classes and in scholarship? And then, of course, the significance of the period itself. So that was our overriding goal, was to help each other sort of reimagine this period. Our more specific goal was to address the issue of place. Again, the dominant narrative often is one that focuses on urban spaces, and New York City sort of looms large in discussions of the Gilded Age. And what we were interested in doing is encouraging a conversation that would prioritize other spaces and other places. And beyond that, to look at the interconnection between regions and between places. And we were happy that Kristen Hoganson was able to join us. A lot of her work addresses this very issue, sort of the interregional aspect of history. Her article that we've assigned to teachers, Meet in the Middle, and then her book, Heartland, engages in that very idea. She's really good at finding the global and the local. And so Randy and I have been using that frame for years in our NEH grants. We were really interested in not only engaging with our SUNY colleagues about the period itself, but also encouraging a look at places and spaces to see how that enables us to reimagine this history. Place was really important in our conceptualization of the work that we do through all the NEHs, but including our work with our colleagues in the Humanities Initiative project. Randy and I created this heuristic, this tool that you see there, Place, P-L-A-C-E, and kudos to Randi. She's the genius that that sort of realized that Place would be a terrific mnemonic device for a teaching tool that is focused on place-based learning. It was, so it worked out beautifully. We have used this heuristic with our NEH teachers over the years, and we introduced it to the our colleagues in the Humanities Initiative grant. And this came about because of the readings that we've done with, Sam Weinberg, who did a lot of work on historical thinking skills, trying to understand how historians read documents and sort of unpacking their intellectual moves when they do that. And also the work of Christine Barron, another scholar who was interested in how historians decipher place. And so reading that literature enabled us to sort of create this device that we use. And so Place is merely a tool that helps teachers, their students, begin the analytical work of understanding places and spaces. So each of those letters means something. So for instance, P is for people. So just as we teach our students to source a document, who wrote it, right? We want to know about the people who created a particular space or place. Who's responsible for this building or this site? How did it come to be? Who are the people responsible for it, and who are the people who interacted with that place? The L is layers of time. So we're interested in the history of place through multiple time periods. So a battlefield, for instance, there was a prehistory to that battle. That landscape had some purpose and had a history independent of the battle. And then, of course, there's the battle. And then what happens after the battle? That space, that place, that landscape often becomes commemorative, right? And almost sacralized, and it becomes a tourist site, right? So if you look at a place across these different layers of time, you can see a longer history and read significance into that. A is for assumptions. These are the questions that we bring to particular spaces and places. Often we don't know the answers to them, but this is where we sort of allow our imaginations to run wild and ask questions about, why does it look like that? How do we think this was used, right? And so it kind of inspires further research and allows us to, based on our knowledge of analogous places, to come up with plausible scenarios to understand this place. C is construction. This sort of maps onto what Weinberg calls corroboration. We ask about the architectural design features of a particular space or place. What are the details that we're looking at that might remind us of other places similarly constructed? How does form and structure and design shape one's experience of that place? And then E is empathy. imagining how people who interacted with the space were affected by it. So, you act one way when you're on Racket Lake in that kayak at, a sunrise. You might act differently if you're, at a frat party, right? So different spaces enable, encourage, limit different kinds of reactions. So place was really important, and it's been a useful tool, I think, for us in helping teachers and ultimately their students engage with places so that they can start unpacking and doing that kind of analytical work that we typically do with texts, like diaries, newspapers, and that sort of stuff. And then finally, dissemination. It's really important for NEH, our sponsor, but also us, that the work that we've been doing has an afterlife. We see this with our NEH grants. Teachers will write back to us and tell us, kind of the things that they've been doing and how they've incorporated their learning from our projects into their own teaching, and that's always sort of gratifying. SUNY Lab, right? This is an example of dissemination, right? We want to share our experiences with you all. We've also encouraged our colleagues who participated in the Humanities Initiative grant to return to their campuses and take what they've learned and create new courses or revise existing courses, incorporating the experiences and learning, teaching, the new scholarship that we all got to experience at our summer institute. I did a bit of this myself when I taught last year our course at SUNY Cortland on the GAPE. I sort of reoriented what I normally do in that class, which often is sort of chronological, thematic kind of exploration of the period. And instead I foregrounded place. So I sort of took students metaphorically to different places, and we used those spaces, places, as opportunities to try to understand the period. So for instance, one of the earliest places we went was a Victorian parlor. And I tried to get students sort of in the mindset of what that space looked like. And so we had readings and images and thought about, the ways that gender and class was defined and shaped by that particular space. So it was a, experiment, to be sure. But I think the students really enjoyed understanding and coming to learn about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era from this exploration of space. Each of the students were in groups, and each group picked a place themselves, and then did some research and presented their place to the class. So curricular, we want to see if what impact we might have on the curriculum across SUNY. Another opportunity for dissemination it relates again to K-12 teachers. So each of our SUNY campuses probably exists in communities where you may have relationships with your teachers in your local school districts. Some of you may already have outreach opportunities that you do with your local schools and teachers. We really wanted to provide some resources to participants in our program to provide some professional development opportunities and outreach to school teachers in those regions connected to SUNY campuses. So that's another way we're hopeful that the work that we've been doing will have an afterlife in the schools. And then finally, the book. So we're as Michael mentioned, we are co-editing a book with many of our SUNY colleagues called Beyond the City. So at this point, I'm going to turn that over to Randi, who's going to talk a little bit more about the thinking behind the book. So Randi?
Thanks, Kevin. So, hi everyone. I just first want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and of course to Michael and Linan for making this possible. Really, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the book project and kind of the thinking behind it and how it's framed. And some of the kind of themes that are weaving through the different sections and chapters. So really, we're imagining Beyond the City. This book project is really well suited for teachers and researchers of this period who are teaching in AP high school classes, community college, first and second year, college students. It's like this level of engagement where, you're kind of bored with the typical textbook story of the long, 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, like the GAPE period, which very typically takes us to, immigrant neighborhoods in New York City, industrial centers in Chicago. It tells the story of those progressive reformers who impose their values and, try to, imagine their version of democracy. And we know that there's been like a lot of scholarship that it's challenged this kind of traditional telling kind of chronology and focus on the urban, certainly within the last 10 years, but very little of it has made its way into most of our textbooks. And so Beyond the City is really an attempt to like refocus and reclaim this period by questioning the typical periodization, right? So when is the Gilded Age? And then also, where is the Gilded Age? And so we are very much trying to democratize the experience of this period by taking it out of these New York and Chicago and bringing it to kind of all sections of, in this case, New York State. So we're using New York State as our case study to introduce place-based pedagogy, place-based thinking, and to think about how the themes of the era that have been explored in the most recent scholarship, how they live throughout New York State. So the way that we're organizing this project is we have kind of like organized into two main sections, and part one is really kind of the big framing. So it's the framing of place-based pedagogy, and it's the framing of these big questions of chronology and place. So Kevin and I are doing the place-based thinking and pedagogy and how that can help people in their classrooms to kind of take the example, like to take this set of essays as a starting place, and then to bring the themes and to bring the pedagogy into their own communities and into their own classrooms. And this is where Kristen Hoganson and Rebecca Edwards are going to be featured in thinking kind of more broadly about the rethinking of this period along the lines of chronology and place. And then part two is really where we're going to have the 14 short essays by scholars across, SUNY history departments. And everyone is really situating their essay in a place and then looking at how various themes of the era permeate through this space or place. And so some of those are thinking about, training spaces, places like schools or military training camps, or like Chautauquas, places where it's civic ideals, gender expectations, and cultural values are shared, imposed, sometimes contested. We're looking at natural landscapes, right? Not as kind of static, untouched spaces, but places like you know, we have an example of an essay that thinks about the railroad and like how new modern technologies make their way into these natural landscapes and often create all kinds of consequences and disturbances, especially not just for people and the landscape, but also for animal life, for example. The Adirondack Lakes become a site of where questions of control and access lead to political and physical conflict. Sanatoria throughout the Adirondack spaces reveal a history of science, public health, and medical ethics coming into conflict with capitalist realities. We have essays that deal with memory and commemoration, and how ideas of race and gender and nationalism are experienced throughout the state. There are some authors that are recentering traditional political narratives by using legislative halls, political commissions, and Indian reservations, for example, to re-examine connections and conflicts between urban and more rural populations. And so fortunately for us today, oh, sorry, one more thing. In addition, in addition to the framing essays and the 14 kind of thematic essays, each essay is also going to have a cluster of primary sources connected to the themes of their contribution. And each cluster will have a head notes that contextualize the sources, followed by kind of thought-provoking questions that instructors may decide to use with their students, or just may help them think about how to apply the material, the themes, the questions, again, to their own region or to their own historical inquiry. So we are very much hoping is that those primary sources will be very useful to helping broaden and widen instructors' ability to think about this period, you know, outside of these traditional urban spaces. And then also we hope to have an online companion where additional primary sources in support of these themes and chapters will be able to live for broad use and wide distribution. So to give you like a deeper taste of the kinds of examination that is going to be going on in the collection, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleagues. First to Dr. Rennie Scott-Childress from the History Department of SUNY New Paltz, and then to Dr. Scott Moranda, my colleague in the History Department at SUNY Cortland. So Rennie, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you, Randi. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate being here today. Sharing my screen. So the focus of the little brief version of the chapter that I'm presenting today, I'm calling it Building the Southern Plantation in the Hudson River Valley, the Invention of the Black Plantation Mammy Stereotype in the 1890s. The work that I'm doing here grows out of a larger project that I've been working on, looking very closely at how a lot of the things that we associate as being Southern, being part of the old Confederate history, were actually created by Northerners, for Northerners, 30, 40, 50 years after the Civil War. And so I'm looking very closely at where these places exist in people's imaginations and why they decided to go to, if you will, live there, at least in imagination, at certain points in their lives. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this stereotype image of the Southern plantation. This is a scene from Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara running out of the huge house here. This was, of course, a blockbuster novel then movie of the 1930s. And one of the crucial characters in it, you can see on the right there, is the mammy figure. And this was a character that had become really widespread, used by many Americans in the late 19th, early 20th century. We run into a problem, though, when we think of that stereotype as having been born, as it were, as you see here, and never really having changed over time. So, as Randi mentioned, one of the things that we'll be doing is providing some primary sources. And what I want to present here, we're not going to read all of this. I just want you to see that this concept, the figure of the mammy, was in fact not racially marked in the 19th century. Most of the figures who were called mammy were of one of two types. Either it was an affectionate term for mother, so instead of mama, you have lots of children in literature calling their mothers mammy, no matter what race they were. Or the mammy was any woman who served a sort of mother function in another woman's family. So she could be a servant, she could be a nurse, she could be a general helper, she could be paid, she could be unpaid, wealthy, poor. So when we look, we can see, though, that no matter what race the mammy was, there were certain characteristics that would hold true to this figure through the 19th century. So in this particular story, which was by Catherine Maria Sedgwick, this is about a family in the North who had a mammy because the mother of the kid in the story, Charles, has died. And so he's living with his grandfather and the old family servant. So I've highlighted a couple of bits of text here that are part of this growing sense of who the mammy was and what the characteristics were. So first off, the name, old. These were usually older people. She was the privileged order of the faithful old servants. This is a crucial thing, that the servant here stays with the family through thick and thin, through rich and poor, almost like a wife would do. They refer to the home that she works in as her little empire. There's a lot of sentimental connection here, as when Charlie dirties up Mammy's floor, she gets mad at him. And so he gives her a little kiss, and then everything is fine. And then at the end there, you see how strong and sacred are the ties of this connection, even after Charles comes back after decades away, and he hugs the faithful old creature. So in this particular case, this character was a white woman. The next, for the rest of this, though, I want to look at images because they're a little bit easier to pick out and look at some differences and think through how it is that historians have not really noticed the historical development of the mammy. Part of the problem is, first I want to note, though, so this is one of the places where this imaginary South was created. This is the Nyack Country Club. And in 1892, the well-heeled members of this club decided to put on a play that was really popular throughout the whole North called An Old Plantation Night. So you have doctors, you have lawyers, their wives, in this country club, and they actually put on this play, put on blackface, but they also introduced a new character who's not listed in the play, and that was the Black Mammy. And so I'll talk a little bit later about why they were so enthralled with this particular figure. But first, I want to note how the character of the Black Mammy was actually quite slow to develop. People were using the figure for lots of different purposes all the way into the late 1880s. This is a picture of a woman named Mammy Lucy from a very popular book of the 1830s and then republished in the 1850s called Swallow Barn. Some people might mistake this for the stereotype of the Black plantation mammy, but the story has very little to do with these figures or these characteristics that you saw in the previous excerpt. There's nothing really about her connection to the white family that whose plantation she lives on. There's nothing about her caring for the white children of the family. She's not particularly sage in her advice to the white family. She does have some physical characteristics that we would see in the mammy, but the crucial thing is that this particular story is all about how her son, one of her sons, who was something of a troublemaker, was sent to sea by the master of the plantation. and eventually died. And the story is all about the grief that she feels, the madness that she enters into on feeling this terrible loss of her son. So it's quite different from what you would expect looking just at the picture. The story is quite different from what you might expect if your only sense is that this is the Black plantation mammy stereotype. In the middle part of the 19th century, Northern white women, a lot of them were becoming increasingly wealthy. They were starting to live in bigger and bigger houses. They could not take care of those houses all by themselves. And so they began running into a problem. Ideologically, particularly in the era of the Civil War, they had a very powerful belief in the ideal of equality. They believed that all women should be equal. At the same time, they started running into this issue of needing to hire servants to help run their households. And so this ideological dilemma was played out in huge numbers of articles and books about what was called the servant problem in that time period. Even somebody like Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a series of articles on how to try to navigate this problem of how in a republic women could hire other women to be their servants. Here you can see one of the solutions that these domestic service writers came up with was an attempt to racialize Irish women, to, in a sense, say, well, it's okay to exploit their labor because they don't have the capacity to be equal with true women. So here you can see one of the things that artists did in various ways. The figure here is quite similar to the later plantation mammy stereotype. You can see a buxom woman. She's clearly made to be ugly. That removes her then from any kind of sexual attraction for the men of the household. She's gruff. She has kind of simian features. And she's also not very good at what she does. She's dropped her plate there. But you can also then see that the relationship, the joke here has to do with how the servant has come to rule in the household. So by the 1880s, this was one of the last pictures of this type to appear in American culture because Irish immigrant women had found quite a number of ways to escape from having to work for other women in their households, either through marriage, through savings, and through other methods. They were able, and the other problem was that they were so truculent, at least in the literature, that most Protestant white middle-class women really did not want to hire them anymore. So they were desperate for help. They didn't know where to turn. And that's when we start to see the articulation of this other figure. Now, it's important to note, though, that just because you see a Black woman who seems to be in this kind of role doesn't mean that it's an image of the Black plantation mammy stereotype. Here is a figure from 1875. This was on the cover of Harper's Weekly. And if you look quickly and don't pay a lot of attention, it looks like this is part of the stereotype. And indeed, one historian looked at it, and that's exactly what she thought it was. A stoop-shouldered African-American woman holds a pipe and gazes into the steam. And the historian sees it as a picture, a quote, a characteristic sketch of Southern Negro life. And the way that this historian is presented is it's just a reverie for the old plantation. So the historian has misread this as something that fits very much within the minstrel tradition, the idea that freed Blacks after the Civil War really wanted to go back to the old plantation. But if you read the actual text that goes with it, you can see that the reverie here is not of returning to the plantation. The reverie is the destruction to her family wrought by the Civil War. In fact, this is a picture in which this woman is wondering about the cost of freedom. She's now lost, in a sense, her place as a mother. Her children are scattered, but she doesn't want to go back to the plantation. You can see there that she talks about the horrors that were there. So one of the things that I want students and teachers to be able to take from this is precisely looking very closely at the context and the use that a historian, or rather that an artist, a reader, or a writer puts this figure to, so that they can be clear about when it is that the Black plantation mammy stereotype really took hold. So this is the 1870s. Another example of the transformation of this figure is from this story that actually appeared twice. In the 1850s, it appeared in a newspaper, in a Hudson River Valley newspaper, that is. And in the original story, the servant is not marked. She's called Mammy, but she's not marked as a Black woman. She's not, she speaks in standard English. She doesn't have any of the other characteristics that we associate with the Black Mammy. Here, though, when it was republished in 1872 in book form, you can see that they've changed the character quite considerably. In the text, this character now speaks in a Black made-up cacographic dialect. She refers to the man of the house as Massa, even though this takes place in a northern city. So in this particular case, we can see this transformation from a non-racially marked servant to one that is clearly racially marked, although not complete. You can see that the figure on the left, she's not wearing a turban. She's not really wearing I guess she's wearing a bit of an apron, but it's not the classic figure of the stereotype mammy that we'll see in a second here. This is getting at the classic stereotype. The classic stereotype of the mammy was a Black woman, older, buxom, ugly, wearing an apron and so forth, but closely associated with a Black child, or with a white child rather, not her own children. By the 1890s, this had become a standard trope. And you can see here that the figure in lots of instances is associated with the white people she cares for. She has little interest in her own Black family. She's, though somewhat similar in a lot of ways to that character of the Irish woman that we saw, large, buxom, muscular. But here, even if she is somewhat standoffish, even if she does try to command her white employer, at the same time, the psychology that these authors are trying to introduce is that she wants to be a servant, and that she is the one, not the employer, who's actually enforcing this kind of division that allows the white employers to believe in equality, even as they are exploiting the labor of their servants. So that's what my chapter is largely on, looking closely at this evolution, trying to help students and teachers be able to develop some skills in really closely analyzing historical context and the uses, the actual uses to which figures such as this could be put. Thank you.
Should I just jump right in? Okay. All right. Just a second. So hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. First, a little bit about me. I'm actually a Germanist, so I'm not sure if I really belong here in a project on GAPE. My research focus is environmental history. I teach German history, but also global environmental history here at Cortland. My familiarity with the scholarship on the Progressive Era is mostly through the lens of environmental history, but also on German American ethnic politics and migration. I'm coming out in my chapter as a historian of tourism and environment. So I wrote a book on East Germany on the intersections of tourism and environmental policy in the Cold War period. Right now, I'm doing a transatlantic study of how Germans and also German Americans thought about and talked about progressive era land use in the United States, and how that their discussion of that contributed to ethnic identity, both in the US and in Germany. And I continue to write about the global history of nature tourism and ecotourism in various venues. So my chapter is about tourism at Racket Lake in the Adirondacks. I teach a summer course called Tourism and the Environment in the Adirondacks for SUNY Cortland. It's at our facility on Racket Lake. In over 2 or 3 iterations of the course, I've had students work on research projects related to hotels on Racket Lake. And the map you're looking at here, and this is all to contribute to a digital mapping project that I am developing. What you're looking at here is a map of hotels in the Racket Lake, along the shores of Racket Lake. Students worked with me to collect advertisements and images from guidebooks and newspaper databases. They even helped a little bit with writing short descriptions that you see on the left there for the project. For this, so the project, they've mapped hotels. When I teach the class, I collaborate with an economics professor who brings economics students, and we do a service learning project on food security in the present and in the past in Racket Lake. So most recently, I had students do a similar thing, kind of going back to our sources and looking for references to farms and gardens. And this map, just an additional map showing the location of where people were growing food in the vicinity of Racket Lake and its watershed. But what I want my chapter to focus on is a confrontation that I encountered as I was developing this course and working with my students. I became intrigued by a confrontation in 1896 on the lake where South Inlet, where you see this cluster of points here, enters the lake. I read about it in Seneca Ray Stoddard's guidebook to the Adirondacks, which would be one of the sources I would use, would attach to my chapter, but also in the diaries of a German-Hungarian doctor who owned a camp on Racket Lake. William West Durant, who owned Camp Pine Knot, which is now Camp Huntington, owned by SUNY Cortland, positioned over a dozen armed guards to prevent access to the trout fishing waters of South Inlet to the south of the lake. And an angry crowd of locals boated to the log and chain barrier at the mouth of the inlet in the hopes to tear it down. They planned on tearing it away and opening up the inlet to common usage. They complained to state officials that landowners had no rights to close public highways. And so South Inlet they saw as a public highway for transit, but also for fishing. So as I'm approaching this and I'm thinking about this, I'm coming at it from my work I've done on kind of nature tourism in places like France and Germany, and some writing I've done on ecotourism around the world. Often in the historiography of tourism, the emphasis is on how urban tourists colonize distant rural spaces. And Racket Lake really fits that model for sure. This is about tourist industry, different kinds of tourists remaking this space to meet their desires. But I do think more can be said. So, that one thing that I've noticed in the literature on the history of tourism is that, yes, there's colonization, but there are various actors in these histories: tourists, tourism workers, tourism entrepreneurs, local residents. And they often play unexpected roles that kind of complicate the story of insiders and outsiders. So my investigation of this place is to think about who are the different people using this place? How are they imagining it differently? And often one group you might think of as tourists, we might just have kind of a monolithic idea of what a tourist is, but there are actually different kinds of tourists at Racket Lake. There are the owners of private camps, the Durants and the Huntingtons, the Rockefellers. But there was also a second tier of tourism, still wealthy, but maybe closer to what we might loosely and probably wrongly call middle class, professionals, doctors, lawyers, smaller business owners, and maybe even industrialists, but not on the scale of a Durant or a Huntington. They were not staying at private camps usually. They were often staying at hotels, those different hotels and private rented cabins around the lake. So I think looking at these two different kinds of tourism allows us to rethink some of the history of conservation, or at least kind of complicate it in some ways, the history of conservation in the Progressive Era in the Adirondacks. So the wonderful work of Carl Jacobi, I never know how to pronounce his last name, really emphasizes this class war between downstate sports tourists and local residents who worked as guides or worked as camp caretakers. And Gilded and progressive age conservationists allied with these downstate tourists in a disdain for kind of crude locals mismanaging the wilderness who needed to be regulated and controlled in their use of timber, wildlife, and the fisheries. Jacoby briefly mentions this actual confrontation at South Inlet in his book, and he situates it in a larger story of Adirondackers who saw the park as common land, essential to their survival, to sustenance, and insisting that they knew best how to manage that nature, and that the camp owners and conservationists seeking to regulate and exclude them there was kind of a war going on between them. And this really helps us understand this conflict at South Inlet in 1896. But what I discovered in the diaries of this German-Hungarian doctor who had a camp was that 2 of the 3 leaders of the protests actually owned and operated hotels on Ragged Lake. The 3rd leader of the protest actually owned a factory in New Jersey and owned a small camp on the lake, but apparently was not friends with Durant and did not have access to Durant's property to the south of Ragged Lake. One hotelier, Charlie Bennett, owned Antler's Hotel. He, to get a sense, he worked for Durant. He was a camp caretaker. He was a guide, but he also took a trip to Europe to, visit different European resorts and hotels to, so he could shape his menu and his lodging operations at Antler's. In the map, this map here, as you go through it, kind of gives you a sense of the chronology of this conflict, kind of the deeper context, but also the different characters that are involved. So I'm still trying to figure out how to package this story for this volume, but the story kind of starts with fish. By the 1880s, hotels were advertising the abundant wilderness hunting and fishing experience for their guests. But by this time, the trout population of Ragged Lake was in a crisis. It was plummeting for a variety of reasons, in part because of market fishermen supplying hotels on Lake George and Lake Champlain with a kind of a wild dining experience, but also by all the sport fishermen, including the Durants and people like the Durants in their overfishing of those trout waters. And also because state officials, to attract more tourists and to satisfy tourist demands for fishing, had stocked the lake with black bass, which has a really negative effect on native trout populations. Right? So there's a kind of a crisis in not just an environmental crisis, but it's also a crisis for these hotel owners because, they are advertising that guests could hunt and fish as much as they wanted. They're advertising meals and dining halls rich with fresh game, alongside fresh produce, eggs, and dairy from local farms and gardens, which is the other part of the mapping project. But Durant happened to own and restrict access to the best remaining fishing waters around Ragged, which was along South Inlet and the trout streams in what was called Sumner Park, which was a private hunting reserve or hunting park for Durant and his friends, including that German-Hungarian doctor who was a close friend of Durant's. So in other words, this confrontation was not just about sustenance and traditional common rights. It was partly that. Many of these hotel owners were continuing to kind of live off local wildlife and fisheries to feed themselves. But it was also about one tourism sector clashing with another. Hotels that needed to keep their guests happy and pay off their mortgages, sometimes borrowed from Durant himself, versus great camp owners who wanted to cater to their friends and their political connections and their clients in their exclusive hunting parks. So we kind of had dueling colonizations of this space by 2 different classes of tourists. And I want to kind of just foreground that conflict. And this is not just about locals and outsiders versus locals versus outsiders. So I think the chapter will help us think about place in a couple ways. One, a micro history of one tiny place, so not just Ragged Lake, but literally the mouth of South Inlet. How the history of that place complicates, or maybe helps us better add to our narratives of Gilded and progressive age conservation and land use. But second, thinking about through the history of tourism as a history of contestation of space by different types of tourists and different types of locals, and how the tourist and cash economy related to tourism, including those gardens and the hotels and those dining halls, is blurring the lines between worker and entrepreneur, between local and outsider, between sustenance and cash economy, but also between the wild and pastoral, especially thinking about all those gardens and farms that are right there in the middle of the wilderness. And they're no longer there today. So, yeah, so I have a lot more to think about how to connect this to the themes of GAPE and package it, but that's what I'm working on. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. That was great. And Rennie. Good stuff.
Thank you, Scott and Rennie and Randi and Kevin for these presentations. I believe our Q&A function is down, so we're going to use the chat function for if you want to write a question, or if anyone wants to just propose to speak. I think let's see, you may just need to note that in the chat. We can unmute your microphone. Are there any questions or comments? And this includes those of you who spoke as well for each other. Any thoughts about this as you're working on the project and kind of sharing it out again in another venue?
Can I just jump in before the question starts? I did want to acknowledge we have another partner on the call. Casey Haller is a PhD student at University of Albany and a proud SUNY Cortland History Department alum. So Casey is going to is our editorial assistant for the project, and was a participant in the Summer Institute and has been part of this process the whole way. And she too will be contributing to the volume. So just wanted to acknowledge that Casey's here.
Hi, Casey. Any questions anyone has? I have a question, and while others think about questions they have, but it's really for the four of you, from the kind of conceptualizing the whole project to these particular presentations. My question is about how these two presentations and chapters seem to strike me as being very much about not place influencing the imagination, but rather the imagination shaping place, in the sense that we learned from Rennie's amazing research about how this vision of the South is actually emerging in the North. You know, the Mississippi Valley is actually shaped by the Hudson River Valley. Place not being made in the place that's being placed, for example. And I was struck that even in Scott's kind of environmental history work, this is the case, in the sense that this little corner of Racket Lake is being shaped by imaginings of wildness and the pastoral, even to the point where the very species of fish that's appearing is not from the place, but is imposed upon the place. So I guess my question for you is, as a project as a whole, as you're working on place in upstate New York in particular, how much is upstate New York shaping the project, and how much are just these other imaginings shaping the place of upstate New York?
I'll go.
I guess. Go ahead.
For me, some of this started with one of my professors in American Studies at the University of Maryland named John Coe. He wrote a book called Imaginary Social Worlds. And later on, I got more and more interested in actual cognitive theory and how our minds work and how it is we, quote unquote, see the world, which is actually how we construct the world. And a lot of times, you know, it's our interests that cause us to see in a certain way. And the powerful thing for me about Coe's book was understanding that, you know, we have lots of friends and people who populate our social world that we've never met before. So I can say Britney Spears. Everybody here knows Britney Spears. Everybody here has had probably to some degree some imaginary conversation with Britney Spears, even if it's like, who are you? What are you doing in my head? Right. And so the question then for me comes back to not necessarily how the imagination creates these places, but rather how it is we use imaginative symbols, cultural tools to make things in the world so that we can justify our actions. So, for example, these it's largely women that I'm talking about in this particular piece, but they have a strong need, which is they really want to be able to enjoy the fruits of a middle class, relatively wealthy lifestyle, but that requires them to make a sacrifice, if you will, to retreat from a universal concept of equality to reducing it. And the way to do that is to use the concept of race. And so race then becomes a way that they reimagine the place of the plantation. So a lot of historians will talk about the plantation in the late 19th century as a place of nostalgia. But these people in the North, in the Hudson River Valley, that's not their nostalgia. The plantation wasn't that for them before the Civil War. And so what you see is then this continual production in the North, in newspapers, magazines, books, and other venues of this place, because it really satisfies this dream that a lot of folks had of being able to exploit labor without feeling like a hypocrite. So I appreciate what you're saying about the imagination, but I just want to say from my thinking here, it's much more about a tool that people are engaging rather than simply a kind of, walking through this cloud, which to me the imagination suggests.
Yeah, I was thinking of two things. It's a great question. One, the place is literally pushing back in the sense that their vision of a fishing abundance is failing in part because the realities of the ecosystem and how that fishing food chain works. So like sometimes these imaginings kind of crash as the environment responds to those attempts to oppose that imagining into that place. But I think also just for the history of conservation in the progressive era and Gilded Age, lawmakers creating these rules that they're imposing on local residents in the Racket Lake, whether they're hotel owners or guides or not, and they're often their allies are these great camp owners. And Durant would have he portrayed his hunting reserve as also a project of preserving these fisheries from overuse, even if and access. And so, how do these locals imagine they should be using that space? And it could be as sustenance and kind of this idea of the common lands, but I think it's also they're imagining their own capitalist economy that it's very unique to their space, to the kind of infrastructure of tourism in that place, and that's informing their critiques of conservation and camp owners as well. Maybe that's just my initial thought.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I think when we conceptualized the project and including the other NEH grants, I think we did often think about this sense of imagination because particularly when we think about the Adirondacks, where our grants take place, the contrast or the relationship between that space and New York City, where many New York City people are going to the Adirondacks for these sort of excursions. They're also imagining what that experience is, right? And so there's a fair amount of sort of illusion and as they're projecting ideas onto landscapes, right? So New Yorkers are projecting sort of this imagined landscape onto the Adirondacks, and in doing that, they're sort of creating this space that's partly reflects reality, but partly doesn't, right? For many of them, it's this pristine, unknowable, wild environment. But often when they get there, they see that as Scott's map, you can see the rail line in there. There's actually infrastructure up there, and we often talk with our teachers that the Adirondacks has industries there. It's an industrialized landscape. We don't think of it that way, right? Because we too often have an imagined landscape in mind when we think of Adirondack. But there's lots of industries in this period that populate that space. So I think your question is a really interesting one, because it's that sense of imagining of different landscapes is really, I think, really important to us.
Randi, did you have any thoughts about this, or?
I mean, I have nothing new to add. I mean, I think, I love your question. I love all of your questions, Michael. You're just so creative. But I think very much, how Kevin's talking about this, we think a lot about, not just the imagining of the wilderness and the wild, but the imagining of the urban. Like, what does it mean to be like urban, and how do these two landscapes talk to each other in this period of time? And that's like a lot of the work that we do, and a lot of, you're, in part, right, how the imaginings are shaping the landscape, but then also how the actual landscape is shaping the imaginings, right? So it's a very interesting dialectic, I think.
Dialectic between the two, as Scott was pointing out, and Rennie in a way too, the realities of class development, class position, or environmental realities impose themselves on the imagination, as well as it's not a blank slate, although it's not a static place either when we think about these locations.
Yeah.
Fascinating. There's a question that came in from Rennie's class, and would it be better to read it, or do you guys want to speak? Is it hard for Rennie? Are they able to speak, or should I just read it? What's the better?
Well, I can just answer it too, but.
Well, let me read it so everyone else, in case people didn't see it in the chat. The class asks, we have a question. Does the culture of the South or slave societies in the South imply a mammy stereotype, even though there was no real definitive concept of who makes a mammy?
Yeah, so you guys, I'll get my revenge in a little while. But I think one of the important things that I suggested has to do with the method of how we study a symbol. And so what I did in this project was, what a lot of historians have done is they've done an important thing, which is to articulate the attributes of the stereotype. It looks like this, does these sorts of things, lives in this kind of place, so on and so forth. But then the problem is that when they go back in time, any figure that has some of those attributes, they just reject. So there's one book in particular I'm thinking of where the historian is talking about the mammy, but doesn't talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin at all, because it turns out that the two figures in there that are kind of in this vein don't fit the classic stereotype. So she just rejects them. And then there's others. And there's white mammies that doesn't fit, in the box of the black mammy stereotype. So this person just rejects it. So the first thing is, articulate the attributes. But then, so what I did is, instead of only looking at certain instances, I actually use a newspaper database. So I go to the Hudson River Valley newspaper database and started counting how many Black women are there in stories in each of the decades of the 19th century. And what's interesting is there aren't very many before 1890. And another aspect of this is, before the Civil War, most of the discussion of the plantation, most of the articles, mentions of the plantation, they're very male in terms of who's there. It's the male slave who's the real focus of so much of the abolitionist literature. There is some, of course, about women, but at least in the Hudson River Valley, the newspaper articles tended to focus on that, the maleness of it. So, when you put these attributes all together, it's only in the 1890s that you start to see that all of the attributes of the plantation mammy are there. You also see virtually all white mammies disappear. There's an article that I quote in the chapter from about 1910, where this preacher is warning people in the Hudson River Valley, don't allow your children to refer to their mother as mammy, because it'll be confused with this Black stereotype, basically. Right. So this has a lot to do with method of thinking about who is it that's creating that definitive concept of the mammy. And so, there's clearly also a difference. A lot of white Southerners were creating, in a sense, a different mammy for something of a different purpose than the Northerners who lived in the Hudson River Valley. So that would be an interesting thing to take up, to think about how those are distinct from each other.
Rennie, can I ask if you could talk a little bit more about the timing of this? So, I mean, I think I heard you say in your presentation, the servant problem connected to the Irish servants, having other opportunities. So becoming domestics wasn't, it became a decreasing pathway for Irish women. What was that so I mean, I'm trying to understand, like, why is that a trigger moment for the 1890s, that this mammy figure sort of emerges, or is that part of a larger constellation of reasons why you're seeing this figure emerge when she is?
Well, a quick example is there are historians of Irish American history who've looked at the number of negative stereotype cartoons of Irish women in particular. And there's a fluorescence of them basically from about the 1860s into the 1880s. And they virtually disappear after 1890, 1900. And when you count the number of Black women and Black domestic servants who were appearing in jokes and stories and so forth, that number skyrockets. So there's some ways of seeing how, the readers, the people who are purchasing culture in the North are thinking differently, but it's the same issue in terms of exploitation of labor. And it's the same practice of using race to allow themselves to exploit labor. It's just that one group didn't work out, and then they turned to another. And it's very, Michael mentioned imagination. So it's very much, though, a cultural project, because there were not very many Black people who lived in the North before World War I. So New York City, for example, less than 2% of the population was people of African descent. So, that means you've got folks who are in the North, white folks are becoming really excited about this seemingly perfect servant. You also can find quite a number of stories that talk about the Black mammy specifically in terms of psychology, and trying to say, this is what Black people are like. A lot of the reviews, too, of stuff as wacko to us as Thomas Nelson Page's stories about Black servants in the South, they responded as if it was ethnography. And so they would say, oh, his depictions of the Negro, quote unquote, are the real thing, right? So that's why I think that you can periodize this. And that becomes important, too, because the 1890s is a time when a lot of Americans are starting to get really confused about racial nomenclature in general because of all the immigration. And so there's a subsidiary benefit, which is they start to move more and more toward thinking about race, not in terms of all these different groups of people like Ruthenians and Belgians and the British versus Slovakians. They start to shift to a different nomenclature, which is color. And that's in the United States. We now, as we've collapsed those two terms, race and color, for us are the same thing. But in other places, in Europe, they're not. So, that's why the larger impetus or larger importance, I think, of what I'm showing is that it helps us to see that the 1890s were this crucial time period for the way Americans began to rethink what a race is and how you use races to accomplish certain ends. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Other questions? I was going to ask about something both of maybe a little more Rennie's talk, but I think Scott maybe too. I could tie this in, and Kevin and Randi I'd be curious about your thinking on this too. And Casey as well, if you have thoughts about it. Which is, these presentations got me thinking about bodies in space. And I was curious about the body as kind of part of the story of this project. You know, in a way, I mean, I guess the Adirondacks is partly an imagining of no bodies in space, but then it becomes bodies on property, like who can put who can guard the south corner of the bay, and with that, you know, who belongs where with their bodies and who gets to go where. And of course, Rennie's work here is very much about kind of representations of the body and how bodies are becoming racialized for class and gender purposes and so on. So that's kind of my question, I guess, for you in these two chapters, or in other parts of the book, or in your broader thinking. Where do bodies fit in all of this, in this story of place?
Scott, were you gonna jump in?
I don't know if I have a whole lot to say. I mean, with the farms and gardens, of course, like there's the fear of the danger to the body of consuming milk and living in the city where milk is so dangerous, you can get, you know, diseases. So part of the existence of that pastoral is not just because it's hard to ship food in, but also because people are excited for, you know, fresh milk and eggs from the countryside, which is not the landscape we imagine in the Adirondacks, but I think it's happening there as well, just like it was in the Catskills and other places where people were getting these farm vacations. So there's something about the health for the body. When you mentioned the guards, I don't know for sure, but there are kind of indications those guards are outsiders. They're not. I think they're not racially, ethnically different, but they're from different communities, different towns farther away from Racket Lake. So I suspect that there's a sense that, you know, Durand is choosing them because they're not loyal to locals. And that's not so much the body, but I think I'm just thinking about who the guards are and who the protesters. There might be more to say about bodies, but you know, that's my initial thought.
Your question makes me think about one of the conversations we had as a larger group around the scholarship around you know, ability and disability and bodies, you know, in that way. And I think how that discussion is going to play out, you know, and in a number of the essays, but in particular, I'm thinking about you know, Jamie's work on militarism and, you know, Plattsburgh and the kind of stuff that was going there on masculinity and ideas of manhood. Certainly also Gwen's work on, you know, the sanatoria and about public health and, like, you know, what does it mean to be disabled or abled, and what does this space have to do with, you know, wellness and health and, you know, bodies. I also think, you know, maybe kind of Karen's work around immigration and immigrants, you know, and reform, but, you know, in more rural upstate areas, and kind of how are people thinking about, you know, these communities and these people and their bodies and where they're allowed to be and not allowed to be, and like the overcrowding of these bodies and the dirt and the filth in the urban spaces versus, you know, what happens to these people as humans in these other spaces. So I think that there's, you know, conversations or the thinking about that very much, you know, I think connected to this idea of ability, disability, bodies is very important, especially in this time period. So.
Yeah, Michael, 2 for 2 on like your amazing questions. But you know, something Randi mentioned, it's sort of resonated. I mean, I was thinking the health as well, right? And go back to Gwen's piece. But also we've talked a lot about, I'm sorry, I keep going to the Adirondacks, but I realize there's a rest of New York that the book is going to talk about, but my reference points always for some reason go to the Adirondacks. But you know, in some ways, like that space creates opportunities to exist in a body in different ways, right? So if you are in a certain class in New York City and occupy a certain, or have a certain gender, there are ways that your body must exist in space. And if you transport that body to a different environment, the Adirondacks, that body can exist and experience the world in a different way, right? I mean, it could be looser and less restrained, and take on activities that are not permissible in other contexts. So, swimming, and we have these great photographs from the Adirondack Experience Museum of women diving, in the lakes, and so for some bodies, they get to experience different spaces in different ways, and I think that's your question sort of made me think of, reminded me of that. So.
Any other questions anyone has? Well, let me end with a last question. Oh, Kristen, did you have a question? No, okay. I saw you show up, so I was just checking. One of our Brockport students here. Then maybe to finish up with the last question, New York State, distinctive, exceptional in the Gilded Age and Progressive era, or archetypal, stereotypical in the Gilded Age? This is a project about New York State. Is this story going to suggest the larger national or even international story, or is this is New York State peculiar?
Yes.
Both and.
I really do think it's a both and, right? I mean, we're hoping that it's going to be expansive enough, New York State, that all of these themes of the era, that we're going to see them play out in interesting ways around the state, in small towns and little hamlets and remote wilderness, in conversation with the urban, the international, and these are themes and dynamics that are playing out, throughout the nation in different ways, with the different casts of characters on different landscapes, with different contexts and histories. And so we're hoping it's like really going to be thought-provoking and a jumping off point for people to say, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about the way that tourism has all of these layers of complexity. I wonder what that was like in our town. Let's go to the archives, let's go figure this out, for us, wherever we are. Maybe not every town is a cultural production, but maybe there's a local newspaper that's thinking about Black women or Native men or, Mexican immigrants, or right. And so we can start understanding what that looks like in our place and in this time, and connect to these larger themes and narratives. So I think there's enough of, that New York State has a little bit of many things, right, that are happening around the country.
Yeah, I think a crucial thing too about this time period is that there's an increase in speed at which information and images, cultural transitions circulate. So, newspapers had traditionally had what they call clipping, so if you look at newspapers a lot from the earlier 1800s, you can sometimes find the same joke 10, 12 years apart, because it took that long to go from one newspaper to another and in different parts of the country. But one of the things that happens with these images that I'm looking at is that you have newspaper syndicates, which will publish the same story with the same mammy figure in it on the same day in places all across the country. The play that I mentioned, An Old Plantation Night, I looked through several newspaper databases, and it played from Maine to Hawaii. You had people in Hawaii doing an old plantation night. And it was, in the same year or two. So I think that one of the things that's very much larger than just New York that brings New York in is it brings the rural areas into these imaginings, or the smaller cities into these ways of thinking about certain kinds of social problems. So you can always find what's unique because, for example, here in the Hudson River Valley, there are a number of stories about older Black women who are venerated and celebrated for being old. And there's not a discussion of them as, in the servant vein. It's very much, they're members of the community and people are excited about it, right? So you end up then with things that are, of course, locally unique, but to a great extent, that speed and reach of cultural industries brings more and more people into a similarity of culture.
So New York State is both a kind of indicator of rural urban dynamics in this period, of gender dynamics, racial class dynamics as they're emerging, new infrastructure that's developing, new imaginings of wilderness and tourism, different competing locals, and in Scott's work, these sort of different locals competing with each other, very particular. But I think the possibilities of this project is to allow someone in Colorado or Nebraska or California or outside the United States to look for ways in which there are again, this kind of connections that are developing that Rennie spoke of, but also just differences, and to hold both of those in yet another dialectic. So the theme of our discussion.
Yeah, on the Adirondacks, I'm always fascinated by how it's both. It's in the history of wilderness is very much part of this larger American story about the wilderness idea and but it's from the regulatory framework and kind of laws and thinking about property. It's very particular. It's actually more like Europe in this time period, in that there are actual towns and people, white people living in that space that the state is having to deal with, where a lot of the early national parks in the West, they were eviction of Native Americans and completely displacement, but they continue to live in the Adirondacks. In early nature preserves and parks in Europe were like that. They had towns and farms and communities in them. And that's later in US history that becomes more common, where you have more of these more complicated state land relationships. But yeah, so I think it's in some ways it is particular, I think, in the US, and a little bit more like other places in the world outside the US. The questions of how do you manage not just land, but also manage people living on that land.
Fascinating too, in that the Adirondacks kind of leads the way in some, kind of chronologically, but then the other places kind of end up more like it. So time and place are always in play as well, I suppose, and in unpredictable ways in terms of what's characteristic and what isn't. Very interesting. Any last questions? I've been hogging up the space. Okay, I don't see any in the chat or online. So I want to give a big thank you to Randi and Kevin and Rennie and Scott for presenting, sharing this work. We're excited to see where this goes. Maybe a few years from now, when the book is coming out, we can do a little webinar return and publication celebration, perhaps. And if you ever want to develop a in-person seminar again at the site on the lake, of course, everyone I think in the SUNY system welcomes the opportunity to go there. Beautiful spot. So thanks again to our presenters and for your research and for sharing it with us today. We're excited to follow this project along as it develops. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. And we hope to see you back here next Wednesday, 5 p.m. to explore multiple methods for Haudenosaunee history. So please join us then. You can register and get the link at the CPD website, or you can email me or check out the SUNY History Lab website. Randi, go ahead.
Sorry, it was such a beautiful wrap up, but I just tried to click on that SUNY CPD and it says it's not there. So I just
let me put it in the
yeah, in case
or
you're wanting
maybe
to
maybe
register.
Lynn can put it in. Let's see if this works.
I just clicked on it and it works just fine.
Oh.
Really? Okay, I'm getting the requested page does not exist.
I put it in again, Randi, see if it works, just to make sure that we.
Yep, that time that one
Okay.
went. I
Something.
don't
Phew. I was
Uh,
gonna have to work overtime.
Well, thanks again to all of you. Hope to see you back here next Wednesday if you can make it at 5 p.m. and or at our June webinar, and stay in touch. And if you're interested next year in presenting something, we have spots open. So just contact me and we can discuss possibilities. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night and wonderful end of the semester.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you for organizing this, Michael.
Special thanks to History 521.
Yeah,
Yeah,
look busy, you guys. I'm coming down.
glad to have you here. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Michael.